Hi everyone, George DiGianni. Dr. Webster is about to come on and we're going to talk about false accusations of cholesterol and fat. You may have heard this before. You might have heard some information from your own doctor and you're really confused, like many years ago. What was better, butter or margarine? Do we have dairy? Don't we have dairy? Certain exercise routines are better for you than others, on and on and on. And so how do we know, how do we decipher what the truth is about our nutrition? Cholesterol, sugar, saturated fat. There's a great book I'm going to promote. Let me just get this with Dr. Webster. I'll talk with you about it in a little while. But first, let's get Dr. Webster on. There's some pressing points he wanted to address here when we talk about cholesterol and fat. Hey, Doc.
Hey, man.
So, you know what's interesting? I've already teased what we're discussing today, but what's interesting is how the medical community dismisses personal trainers. They dismiss nutritionists. They dismiss chiropractors. And it's interesting because this medical community, unless they go outside of what they've learned, they're ignorant about what they're saying. So they're trying to do their best and offer good information, but they're ignorant about what they're saying when it comes to certain things that we constantly hear and have heard our entire life when it comes to cholesterol or when it comes to fat or when it comes to sugar and so on and so on and so on. And it's just, thank God for the internet. That's all I could say, because there are a lot of us who can be our own advocate to some extent, because you don't want to believe everything you read. And you can recognize through credibility, through the studies that are available to every single medical doctor, medical practitioner on the planet. Yet people tend to dismiss something they don't know if it doesn't align with what they believe, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is quite a touchy topic for a lot of people. It's not something that that people will even be willing to accept in a lot of cases. I was reading about our author. I don't know if you've introduced the author of the study or the article that we are talking about today, but I went ahead and read some background information on her. And she was talking with a very famous, very highly credentialed biochemist about some of this stuff. And she just was simply presenting the data that we're going to present today also. And the biochemist just acted like it was just bouncing off his head. It didn't matter what the data showed. It didn't matter it didn't matter how many studies she had in front of her. It didn't matter how well the studies were performed. It couldn't be that saturated fat is not bad for your heart. It couldn't possibly be that cholesterol is not bad for your heart. Those are just givens in the world. Those are just universal norms, and we have to start there. And then we have to do everything we can to learn more about why those things are true. But are they true? That's the real question we're going to ask today.
So what I want you to do is I want you to address this article. I'm going to go in a different place. You and I discussed this. So this is your floor right now. I'll interject where I think I need to. Hold on one second. Daniel is on, and he's asked, is nature's sugar, such as fruit, a viable alternative to high blood sugar levels? So when you... What?
Confusing. Kind of confusing. Is nature's sugar, such as fruit, a viable alternative to high blood sugar levels? An alternative to high blood sugar level? No. I mean, what I'm going to say is sugar is sugar. It doesn't matter whether it's coconut sugar or white table sugar or brown sugar or sugar from fruit. It all goes into your bloodstream. It all elevates your blood sugar. It all raises your insulin levels to different degrees, depending on exactly which type of sugar it might be. But no, sugar is sugar for the most part.
And that's another real difficult hurdle for people to overcome, because you'll hear a lot of, even clinical nutritionists will say this, mostly registered dietitians. Well, no, you got all the fiber in fruit, so the fruit's really good for you. Well, hold on. There are nutrients in fruit, and fruit is good for you. However, I've always got to bring this back down to something I did many years ago when I was in the service industry, the one-on-one industry like you are, Doc, and that is asking what the goal is. If the goal is to manage your blood sugar, then it's important to either pick certain fruit to eat that are lowest in the glycemic index, so green apples, all berries, cherries, and plums, Those are the ones that are lowest on the glycemic index. Or if your goal is to lose fat, then no fruit at all. Does that mean you can't have fruit in the beginning? I mean, afterward you've reached your goal? Of course you can, but stick with the lower glycemic fruits. You can even have fruit while you're losing weight or on any type of diet program, but then you have to look at, is exercise involved, and what type of exercise is involved, and when it's involved, and are you fasting? And I went off on a little tangent because it is impossible. The older I become, and more I learn, the more impossible it is to answer a question like that with yes, no, or one sentence. It can't be done.
All right. Well, exactly right. And the question was specific to blood sugar. And I would just say, if you're concerned about blood sugar, don't consume sugar. It's as simple as that. And just so you know, starch is sugar also. So potatoes, grains, things like that, those also become sugar just as rapidly. So the less of that you consume, the better off you're going to be. And you'll find that when you reduce the sugars and starches out of your diet, you'll find that your blood sugar does respond appropriately to that. And that's not really the topic of today's show, but it's a good question, and I'm glad you asked that.
And he was saying natural sugar. Yes, I know what you mean, Daniel. Right. So get into this article. What was the premise of it? Where are the holes? Where do we shoot holes in it? And then I'll start kind of pulling us back into what I'd like to reference, where people can go for a solid reference about how to get a handle on their health, and how they too can look at every single study that talks about saturated fat that is bad. They too, everybody watching this now, can get this one book, not mine, I make no money on it. You can get this book and you can read how every single study is flawed that I've been talking about for years, Dr. Webster's been talking about for years. Now the proof has been written by these two doctors collaborating on this one book, and then they show you about the benefits and much needed saturated fats in our diet and why, and the evidence that goes to show that. And I talk about this, I'll talk about it a little later on, but why don't you go and beat up this article, Doc?
All right. Well, first of all, I'm excited because I don't even know what book you're talking about, so I'm anxious to hear about that later on in the show. The article, you can find the article if you want to read it on zoeharcombe.com, and it's ZOEHARCOMBE.com. So find it there. The title of the article is Saturated Fat and CHD, which is coronary heart disease in Europe. And the author is Zoe Harcombe. She's a PhD. When I read about her, I was like, okay, who is she? Does she have a PhD in philosophy or in sociology, or what does this doctor actually know? Well, come to find out, she has a doctorate in nutritional analysis, and her thesis, George, was specifically on analysis of the 1973 studies that basically led to the idea that cholesterol is caused by elevated saturated fat in the diet, and that leads to cardiovascular disease. Her PhD was an analysis of this, and she ripped it apart. So I would say she is the perfect expert. She literally has a doctorate in what we're talking about today, and you couldn't be more specific. So I loved it when I read that. She wasn't a PhD in economics or something like that. So I was happy to find that out. Anyway, when you look at this, to kind of go through the basics of what this article touches on, she talks about when you look at the original studies from 1977, Ansel Keys was the person who performed these studies, and he took analysis or took data from a bunch of countries, and he looked at cholesterol levels, average cholesterol levels, and average heart disease between those countries. And he did something very, very dishonest. He picked 7 specific countries.
Six
excuse me?
out of 22.
Oh, okay, 6. 6, I thought it was 7, but 6, we'll call it 6. 6 countries that made it look like he could draw a nice smooth graph that the higher the cholesterol, the higher the cardiovascular disease. And he completely negated the other countries as like, well, why would we even consider these other places? Or, hey, maybe nobody's going to read the study or look into the data, and we can make whatever we want to be the conclusion. So when you only pick and choose the data points that you want, you can actually draw a line that's inverse of what all of the data suggests. So when you look at the original data, you can find the original data in Uwe Ramskov's book, The Cholesterol Myths. He's got all of it plotted out. He shows the correlation lines, where they would be drawn if you drew a true correlation, taking all of the data into consideration. And the truth is, there's virtually no, and in fact, a slight inverse relationship between cholesterol and cardiovascular disease and cholesterol and death rates, overall death rates. So what that means is higher cholesterol does not necessarily mean higher death rates or higher cardiovascular disease or higher death from cardiovascular disease. When you look at all of the data, it looks like the opposite. Now, Ansel Keys used 22 countries at that point in 1977. This author now has data points from 192 countries. So all of the European countries, I believe it's 190, maybe it's 92. I'm sorry, but it's a lot more. It's either 92 or 192. No, it is 192. Sorry about that. But when you plot all of them, luckily, you get the exact same correlation that Uwe Ramskov showed that you got from the 22 countries that were originally studied by Ansel Keys, which is, it looks like just a smattering of dots when you plot it. Some countries with high cholesterol levels have low mortality. Some countries with low cholesterol levels or low cholesterol or saturated fat have high rates, but also the opposite can be true. So there's dots all over the place. It's only when you do rigorous analysis that you see where the relationship falls. And it does in fact fall the same way. It shows that the countries with the highest saturated fat intake have the lowest coronary heart disease rates, and the countries with the lowest saturated fat rates intake have the highest coronary heart disease rates. And that holds for males and females alike. And it also goes even further, and it goes to all mortality rates. So overall mortality, it doesn't just have to be a heart attack or stroke. It looks at saturated fat consumption and just your risk of dying of anything. Also, higher saturated fat equates to lower death. Lower saturated fat equates to higher. Exactly the opposite of what the media has been telling us for 30 or 40 years now.
To ride the tails of the media and the medical community, who do have a point about saturated fat, there's only one way that we can validate everything they've said about saturated fat being bad. One thing. And that's when you mix it with sugar. So it's not, so it's bread, it's chips, it's ice cream, it's the candy when you leave the secretary's office or you come in from the elevator. Every time you take that bit of sugar, the Red Bull, whatever that is, and you're having saturated fat, recipe for death. Fat, death, horrible way of living. You're not sleeping well, you're irritable. That is when it's bad. And if you're going to have high sugar, you better take all that fat out. And I don't really mean that, because there are certain fats we still absolutely need. The disadvantage to our health, we're doing it to ourselves, is when we have sugar.
Yeah.
And so when you couple them together, that's when you're in trouble. So to their point, when they say, oh, well, saturated fat's bad. Well, did you ever look at a study in the 70s that had high saturated fat and didn't have any sugar involved? No.
Right. Yeah, that reminds me of a study when I was in taking a nutrition class in chiropractic school. The professor presented that, hey, we know quite well that eating fat, he didn't say saturated fat, but eating more fat increases your risk of cardiovascular disease. And I said, well, where are you basing this off of? And he pulled up a study. The study was literally introducing French fries into the diet. I mean, it's fried starch. That's way different than saying that you can't assume that introducing fried starch is the same as introducing beef or introducing coconut oil or any kind of fat in general. Fat's such a diverse category of nutrients that you can't deduce anything from one particular fat, and especially when that fat is drenching and frying a starch. It could be the starch. I don't even know for sure if just eating that oil that you fry in would be bad for your heart. I assume it would be, but I'm not even sure of that because I don't think there's ever been a study of somebody who just started taking those that fried corn oil or fried soybean oil, and compare that to somebody eating French fries dunked in that same oil. But we know that eating French fries.
I want to go back to coronary heart disease for a moment. There are some people who genetically have high cholesterol, and they're worried about it their whole life, and their doctor, sometimes scares them about it. And what's really important to know is that there are receptor sites that are in our liver. Some people are not born with as many receptor sites, therefore it can't absorb the LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol, and expel it from the body. So you get this buildup in the blood. When you have that happen, or if that happens through disease, or if you're having a horrible way of living your life, and you don't have the receptor sites at your liver, you're in trouble. That's when you're in trouble, and that's when you're going to need some outside help other than just food. And that's where it's case by case. So we want people to do their own research, and we'll provide the resources to you the best we can.
Let me just address that a little bit. There are people, in fact, that have this. It's called hypercholesterolemia. It just means that you have a genetic predisposition to very high cholesterol. I want to make sure that people understand what that means. It does not mean what is popularly discussed in the media these days. Cholesterol of 220 or 240 or 250 is not hypercholesterolemia. And I'm going to show you a few things why I'm very confident in saying that here in just a moment. Hypercholesterolemia, true genetic hypercholesterolemia, are people that have cholesterol 320 or above generally. Those people do in fact have issues with cardiovascular disease. And even then, it's debatable whether the cholesterol itself is responsible for the cardiovascular disease. But there is a strong correlation between that extreme level. So don't think that just because your doctor says you have high cholesterol, that's not what we're talking about. Hypercholesterolemia and slightly elevated based on these bogus numbers of anything over 200 is high is not the same. We're not even in the same ballpark. When you look at people with, go ahead.
Well, so I think it's really, really important. If there's two takeaways today, one's going to be the direction we take you in as far as resources are concerned. And the other one is this. When you see a cholesterol number that you don't particularly like, or your medical professional doesn't particularly like, ask them if they did a particle test on your cholesterol. Because what's most important is not necessarily the numbers you're looking at, rather the particle size of the cholesterol in your blood. You have small, and then you have the big fluffy, and one's dangerous for you. That is what's the biggest indicator of whether you're in trouble or not. My cholesterol is 240, but my particle size is not in trouble. I don't have an issue with my particle size moving through my blood rapidly. It's not sitting and sticking and all that.
Okay, but we're still in this mode of thinking that high cholesterol must be or probably must be bad. But we have to go back to that Ansel Keys study and realize that he completely fabricated these lines that he drew through the 7 countries that happened to be on the slope that he wanted, and he completely negated the others. So let's stop thinking about 240 being potentially problematic when it comes to cholesterol. I hear what you're saying with the particle size and particle number and all of that. It's reasonable to consider those things. But I would argue that even that is not as big of a deal as we make it out to be. And I want to show people just why I'm saying that above 200, or this ridiculous reference of above 200 being high cholesterol, is completely ridiculous. There have been studies that have looked at this, looked at total cholesterol. The one I'm looking at right now was done in Japan, and it was done people of all ages. And it took the reference range, they consider that like 1.0 risk of mortality. They considered that the people that had cholesterol between 160 and 199. They thought, well, that's the good range. That's obviously great. So let's compare everything to that and see how much higher cholesterol causes mortality to increase. What they found was cholesterol above 200, between 200 and 240 in men, caused a slight decrease in death rates compared to the people that between 160 and 199. So you think, okay, well, that's not that big of a deal, but it certainly says that we don't need to jump to taking statins just because our cholesterol is 210 or 220. But you think, well, yeah, but surely when it's even above that, like above 240, that's when your death rate probably goes up, right? Well, the opposite was true. Men with cholesterol above 240, and that includes the people with really high cholesterol, had even a slightly lower level of death than those between 200 and 239, which was lower than the ones between the 160 to 199.
And when was this? What's the date?
No. One more thing. Here's the shocking piece about this. Those with cholesterol below 160 were the only group that had a really significant change in their risk level. They were more than 50% likely to die because their cholesterol was below 160. Everything else was pretty close to even. On females, it's almost perfectly 160 to 199, 200 to 230 to 239, or above 240 was almost flat. You get below 160, boom, 50% increase, 45% increase for females, about 55% increase in males.
What's the date on that you're looking at?
I do not know. I'm just
curious to see how recent.
I'd have to dig into this. I also have another one that shows the exact same correlation in the Netherlands. It's a 3 graphs, one with mid-level cholesterol, one with low cholesterol, and one with high cholesterol. And they measured mortality rate in the elderly. Those with cholesterol, George, get this. Cholesterol levels 252 or higher lived longest. Those with cholesterol between 193 and 251 lived the middle. And those with lower than 193 lived the shortest.
Let me just interject and say this. I don't want to make people get tired head, like, what the hell are these guys talking about? They completely lost me talking about these graphs. When we as professionals look at our own blood work, someone else's blood work, there are variables to look at. You don't just look at a number. You look at the cholesterol number and the ratio and how high HDL is. And then you look at particle size. Then you look at CRP, which is C-reactive protein. That's an inflammatory marker throughout the body. If that's high and your particle size isn't good and your triglycerides are 100 or higher, you got a problem. Well, let me just interject this for a moment. My cholesterol is 240. My HDL is 79.
Which is good.
A good sign. Yeah. My CRP level is 0.3. It's like non-existent. My triglycerides are 51.
Which is also really good.
Before I went on keto, and I don't want to make this a keto show, ketogenic show, but before I did, I was a fairly healthy guy. I worked out all the time. I had some bad food, but I had more good food, and I would try to work the bad food off. My mentality now is not necessarily how I look, even though I still look fit. It's all about my health. Before I started keto, my triglycerides were 68. Not high, but 51 is a hell of a lot better, and that's from having super, super high fat and super, super, super low carb. And it's so easy to do. So go ahead and talk more about this article, Doc.
Well, that pretty much wraps up the data. The bottom line is, if you look at all the data and you look at all the studies that I've looked at anyway, it does appear that the trend, George, and I'm going to speak to this in a second. The trend is that those places where they eat a lot of saturated fat do not have a lot of cardiovascular disease. Those places that eat little saturated fat do not seem to have lower levels of cardiovascular disease. So the association is inverse. It's certainly not a direct correlation, which is what the media and even doctors would have you assume, is that if you eat saturated fat, your cholesterol will go up. And if your cholesterol goes up, you will have much greater risk of cardiovascular disease. That is completely opposite of what the data actually shows. Now, that does not mean, George, that saturated fat or low saturated fat is causing high levels of cardiovascular disease. It doesn't mean that. This is an association. It needs to be explored, but it doesn't show causation necessarily, but it certainly proves that high saturated fat and high cholesterol does not cause elevated cardiovascular risk, because the association is opposite. You don't get causation with reverse association. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And the only reason they got to this place where they're saying that saturated fat and therefore cholesterol is causing heart disease is because they started from a fraudulent place of saying there's a strong association between high saturated fat, high cholesterol, high cardiovascular disease. It was a lie from the beginning.
Wait. Therefore, are you saying, Dr. Webster, that this is fake news?
It was fake news from the start of from the late 70s.
And then the other thing
Ansel Keys was
the other thing that's important for people to recognize is what we're discussing today when we're talking about the benefits of cholesterol. They make your sex hormones, right? They're very healthy for you. If you don't have cholesterol, you're dead. Okay, we need cholesterol. The benefits of saturated fat, eating a certain way. What we're discussing here is not a one-off study. It's not even a 5-off study, if you will. It's a replicated many times over study, and it's not necessarily done on animals, it's done on humans. What we know to be true, what we're discussing today, is evidence-based. It's not our opinion, it's what we've seen in the field as practitioners, it's what we see in the studies, yet we are not medical doctors. So we don't hold as much weight as a medical doctor. That's what's most frustrating to me. So we have some people coming on, they're saying, hello everybody, good to see you. If you have any questions for me or Dr. Webster, please interject with us, love to talk with you. Do you want me to move on now to like the answer?
Well, yeah, the whole reason I wanted to do this show initially was because we've been talking about ketogenic diets, and when you read into what that entails, a lot of it is consuming fat, and I want people to be aware that they don't have to be so concerned and think that if they consume more fat that they're necessarily going to increase their risk of dying of a heart attack or stroke.
Yeah, it's if you increase more fat and you don't stop the other crap that you're doing in your life. Now you're in trouble, and you're doing it to yourself. So it's really, really easy to follow if you want to. In the night,
I would like to see, George, I would like to see studies on that even. I hear what you're saying, and I know that for sure that your obesity level is going to go up if you eat a lot of sugar and a lot of fat at the same time. There's no question about that. But if you ate a calorie-controlled diet that was high in fat and high in sugar, would your cardiovascular risk go up more than if you just ate that same amount of sugar and low fat? I'm not sure. I think it's the sugar that's causing the cardiovascular disease for the most part. I don't know if adding fat to that is necessarily making it worse. I really don't
think
know. Unless
again, you and I are analytical. We like to break things apart. It's not as black and white. It's not one answer. It's not just cholesterol. There's many different variables to look for, and you could also look at exercise, right? So if somebody...
The 1920s produced the ketogenic diet for people with epilepsy and has a plethora of scientific proof showing the benefits of rapid fat loss, decreased insulin levels, improved sleep, and brain function. Eating high-fat food while significantly decreasing carbs turns your body into a fat burner from a carb burner. Dr. Myhill said the brain and heart run at least 25% more efficiently on a ketogenic diet. How many times have you been disappointed by fat loss results? Less than optimal organ function due to poor lifestyle choices, slow or minimized desired results on any diet. We created the first and only keto cleanse system to be the fastest fat loss program on the market by combining the correct keto diet with a full body cleanse. Change from being a carb burner to a fat burner today. Visit 21daybodymakeover.com/keto, click on keto cleanse, and receive cleanse supplements, a keto cookbook with desserts such as keto brownies and grocery list recipes and exercise videos. That's 21daybodymakeover.com/keto.
And one group has high saturated fat and keeps their sugar. Another group has low carb and high fat. Another group just keeps their diet the same. Then you have another group with a high fat and high sugar, but they exercise with burst training. There's something we didn't consider.
Lots of factors, no doubt about it.
So we can go in many different directions. And these studies would cost, and what I'm about to say, I'm not being dramatic, they would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to perform if you were to look at every single variable you possibly could. Yet you have a really conclusive study that would give us the right direction, wouldn't it?
It would, and it's unfortunate because when you do high level research, oftentimes there's something to gain from the research monetarily, and it's easy to study the effects of a blood pressure medication because if that medication works, the pharmaceutical company can make $100 million off of it. That's why they're willing to put $1 million or a few $1 million into each study because it pays off. But who's going to benefit from a study that shows that switching your micronutrients a little bit causes certain changes in cardiovascular output? I'm not sure who would profit from that. Probably no one. So that's why nobody's willing to put up the millions of dollars.
So when we're talking about cholesterol and saturated fat today, did you know that what we're discussing is not only old news, but it's older than Dr. Webster and myself put together? The 1920s produced the information that showed, that proved, that helped alleviate symptoms of people with epilepsy, Oh, and diabetes. Oh, and Alzheimer's or dementia then, right? Because Alzheimer's, I don't think was a thing yet. Or I called it old timers, like just forgetfulness. So this high saturated fat was looked at starting in the 1920s, and it's not stopped. It's just that now that with the advent of the internet, and if you have a computer, all of this information is at your fingertips. You can choose to look in the direction you want to look, or be uncomfortable and look at the evidence-based information that's been around for a very long time. So here's what I want to promote today. I've promoted it once before, but I have the book in front of me. Super Fuel by Dr. Joseph Murphy, Mercola, rather, and also Dr. James Dinicolantonio. I always get his name wrong. What's great about this book is they go through all of the studies that Dr. Webster mentioned, a couple of them, and they completely annihilate them with evidence-based research that shows how these were biased information, skewed studies, and they're doing more damage today than they ever did because there are too many doctors that still hold on to this old information. Why? My guess is that the information is still being spewed to them through the medical community outside of them that teaches them. I was at a conference not too long ago, big, well-known cardiovascular doctors up there, and he's talking about this, and this, and it wound up turning into a statin commercial.
Yeah, let's just say this. I don't know. I don't want to. Okay, I'll just do it this way. Statin drugs, since the advent of statin drugs, which is the direct result of these falsified studies that make us think that high cholesterol is dangerous for us. Since the advent of statin drugs, the pharmaceutical companies have made $125 billion off of those drugs, off of drugs that were based on a false premise.
And even if they were sued,
you draw your own conclusions.
Even if somebody sued them and they won, let's say, $50 billion, I'm being extreme right now, they would still be ahead.
Yeah,
right?
They would be.
So let me just talk about this real fast. I'm going to post these results on YouTube. I'll also post these results. I don't know if YouTube will let me put the pictures up. So if they don't go to YouTube, then when this Facebook Live post is created and put on here, I'm going to have my assistant put the pictures, my most recent pictures that I shared with Dr. Webster, on here as well. I don't know how we do it, but hopefully she'll find a way to attach all of this, because I go through my cardiac test since over a year ago. And here's something that's really interesting. Before keto, and I'll just go through this super fast, there are different levels of your cardiac health, okay? Your blood vessel health. And type 1, you're like a teenager's blood vessels. Type 7, you better go to a hospital. You're going to have a heart attack right now, all right? So my results before keto around this time last year, I was 46% type 1, 53% type 2. Not that good. You know, we're looking about half and half. I'm hard on
pretty good.
I'm nowhere near 7, but I don't want to creep up to 3. So I start doing keto, and I do it the wrong way. I think I shared this with everybody. For about 4 months, I'm doing keto. I'm eating all this bacon and sausage and, you know, all this other fat, all the good fat as well. And my cholesterol is perfect. My triglycerides go down. My inflammation goes down. So all of that was great, but my hormones shot through the roof. My testosterone increased from 850 to 1400. That's dangerous. Okay, but that also shows the power of fat and how it makes our sex hormones, right? Yeah. My IGF-1, so my growth hormone levels increased, and that was all positive because of the fat. However, when we're looking at the health of my blood vessels, I went from that 46% type 1, 53% type 2, down to an 8% type 1, 92% type 2. Okay, that's not good. That's bad. So now I have hormones shooting through the roof that are going too high. And I say, okay, well, what can I change? What doesn't feel right to me? And then I start doing studying on what I think intuitively just isn't right. And it was the bacon, the sausage, the pepperoni. And I recognized what some people call that as dirty keto today. I believe that to be very true. You can still lose weight by having those saturated fats. However, is that great for long-term health? And I say no. And I have the proof right here in front of me, my cardiac test. So now, 3 more months go by. All I did was remove the sausage, the pepperoni, and the bacon and have them maybe twice a month instead of 2 or 3 times a week. Super high cheese. I'm making cheesecake. I'm making pizza. I'm having all this incredible great fat fish, of course, and high amounts of olive oil and avocado. You ready for this? Well, you saw this, so it's not a surprise to you. Yeah. My vessels now are 77% type 1, like a teenager, 23% type 2.
Awesome results, man. Really good.
Pull out those type of saturated fats. It doesn't mean they're bad for us, but in my experience, in my report, it shows that it was not good for me long-term to keep them in that often. So I needed to rely more on fish and cheese and olive oil and avocado and nuts and so on. And I'll finish up on this. The doc wrote me also, and he said, George, your arteries are cleaned out. Your heart function is off the charts. Great, too. And then he breaks down what DPI means. It means total power outlet of your cardiovascular system. AE is elasticity of my arteries. So you want your elasticity to be there. People who don't exercise, people who smoke, people who eat like crap, and the combination of all those, they have these rigid vessels. They don't expand and contract. That's extraordinarily dangerous. So if you sit on your all the time, you're asking for it.
Yeah, your results are tremendous. You're exactly right. You want your vessels to be able to expand when you want more blood flow and then contract when you want less. And if they don't do that, that really is what hypertension is. So that's fantastic. Pretty much every single one of your markers improved in this last test.
It really did.
And all you did,
and that's because I was making these adjustments along the way. And that's what I think people need to do. I've said this I was on the radio for 21 years, and I've said and maintained this and still stick by this. Nobody can write a diet book. It's impossible. Our genetics are made up completely differently in some respect. Our daily life, our mental stress levels, it can't be done. However, we can say having certain type of food, quote unquote food, the sugar food, is not healthy for us. And having other food has been proven to be healthy with us. What are those ratios? How often? What are the exact foods? How are you exercising? All these variables have got to be taken into consideration. Otherwise, you're doing yourself a disservice. And then what do? Or people tend to do, they jump from one diet to the next diet to the next diet, and it's called yo-yo dieting.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you didn't do that. All you did was took a analytical approach to what was going on in your system. You just simply said, okay, something's not quite right here. It seems like a lot of things are really good, but something's not quite right. And you made an adjustment, and you found that adjustment kept all the good things that were happening, but then also was able to take care of that one thing that you weren't really happy with, which was that progressive change in your arteries. And it makes sense, man. It's good. It's a lot better than jumping, well, maybe this didn't work. Now let's try low fat. Let's see how that works. That would throw your system in such haywire. You would never be able to achieve health if you tried that kind of drastic changes. Just hone your diet. We know what's good. You've got to get your fruits and vegetables, especially your vegetables, keeping the glycemic index low. You need good healthy fats. You need adequate protein. Start there. And then we can make small tweaks from that point. But you have to start with those things because that's where you get your nutrition.
So Wayne Buckner just wrote, hey, Wayne, you can go to 21daybodymakeover.com and you'll see an ugly starburst at the top. Click Keto Cleanse. That page is going to be changed here soon in the next several days. So be aware of that. That's where you can start. You can read a lot more about that. I provide all of the science that you can possibly ever read. It'll take you weeks to read it, proving through evidence-based data that the ketogenic diet or just very, very low carb, high fat is healthy for us. So if you want to take it to your doctor, I encourage you to do it because the only way your doctor can refute what you send them is if they're stuck in their own mindset and they don't want to read it. And a lot of doctors aren't going to take the time to read it.
That's right. Hey, good job. Bottom line here, let's wrap this up unless you have something else that you want to go through. Bottom line is when you look at saturated fat does not increase your cardiovascular risk. When you look at cholesterol levels as a total, higher cholesterol levels does not increase your risk of cardiovascular disease or overall mortality. And when you go even deeper into this, which I didn't even get into these studies, when you go into LDL, which is quote unquote the bad cholesterol, we see that when you look at all of the studies on LDL, even LDL does not correlate to increased risk of cardiovascular disease or overall death. It is not bad cholesterol. So let's get this out of our mind. Let's start eating real food. Some of that food is high in fat. Some of it's high in saturated fat. Some of it's high in cholesterol. As long as it's good, real food, that's what we need to be eating. And get the nutrition from good food.
I want to expand upon something you said earlier. When people, that the mortality rates of people who had cholesterol levels at 160 or lower was much, much higher. Okay?
Yes.
And I just want to delve into that. What I know about that, and tell me if something's changed, is the reason they had higher mortality levels is because their HDL, the good cholesterol, was too low.
No, that's not it at all. Because as I just said, LDL is not the bad cholesterol. We've been misled to think that cholesterol is bad overall. We've been misled to think that LDL is bad cholesterol. It's not. That's not it at all. When you don't have enough cholesterol, you can't make your testosterone, estrogen, progesterone efficiently. You can't make vitamin D efficiently. You can't make cortisol efficiently. You can't repair damage in your cardiovascular system and your arteries. You can't reduce inflammation. Cholesterol has been shown to have a protective effect against atherosclerosis. Also, another thing that happens when you look at overall mortality, people with low cholesterol can't absorb serotonin in their brain. They're more likely, and I mean much more likely, George, to commit suicide because their brain chemistry is unbalanced, because cholesterol is crucial for brain function. So it's very wide. And the other thing is they found is cancer goes up when your cholesterol is low. Low cholesterol is tremendously dangerous for overall health, cardiovascular health specific, and overall health. You do not want low cholesterol, especially low cholesterol between 160, below 160, or maybe even below 193 if you are in the elderly population.
And there's the mic.
And these are all based on human studies. No, these are not mouse studies. These aren't rabbit studies. These are 100% human studies based on analysis of multiple studies across the board.
And there's a mic drop from Dr. Webster. So Dr. Webster's website is CompleteHealthDallas.com. Make sure you share this with your friends. You must share this to get it out beyond our current amount of friends. We really appreciate it if you do that. I'll have this posted up on Facebook at some time, maybe tomorrow, we'll see. And if you have any questions for us, you can certainly email us here. Have a great day, everybody.